Inside those areas of forest, unsurprisingly, are threatened species. Made threatened by land clearing, by agriculture, by forestry, by settlement, by sometimes natural processes. Sometimes species were already rare when Europeans arrived. Many of these species, and in fact most of the rainforest endangered species and threatened species, have lineages that extend back to Gondwana. So most of the threatened species have Gondwanan connections. So they're part of that unique 40 million year evolutionary history, part of that cultural identity of ours that is truly Australian, part of that Gondwanan World Heritage rainforest. So over the last few weeks, as you can imagine, both the media, the community and others have asked numerous questions. And some of those questions repeat. And I thought it might just be worthwhile, rather than reading it out to you, to just throw up some of the answers and talk about some of the species. In this case, the nightcap oak, which is a proteaceous species, belongs to the family Proteaceae. It's a basal part of that lineage, so it's got strong Gondwanan connections, and it's also basal to the evolution of the flowering plants. So this is a lineage that lives with us in our local region, which is down to just a few hundred individuals left on the planet. And that's been affected by the fires. So there's an incredibly important lineage that's already been reduced to a very, very small population size and is now even further reduced and further threatened. So the question is, are there extinction probabilities? Are they increased because of the fires? And the answer is yes, they are. Other species, including Eurymyrtus australis, peach myrtle, and a whole myriad of other taxa that co-occur with these species, are also affected in varying degrees. Some species have fared a lot better than others, and some will be quite content to survive in the matrix of burn, not burn, and so there's a lot of variation. But as you can imagine, it's early days, and national parks, the Save Our Species program and others have been busy trying to inventory those and trying to assess the impacts. But as you can imagine, the scale of that is huge. So that's going to take some time to resolve. But just as an example, within the nightcap alone, within the rainforest areas, 16 threatened plant species and 27 threatened animal species have been affected. Now, if you listen to the media nationally, they're talking about 100 species, threatened species across the whole of Australia affected by fire, and in New South Wales, 70. So just have a look at those figures, just for one forest area, our forest area. How important is this area? Those figures tell you that irrefutably. So what's the recovery going to look like? What happens when you burn ancient rainforests with trees that are sometimes hundreds of years old? And we know in some cases, thousands of years old, individuals. Can you replace those? Well, the answer is yeah, sure. Seedlings will grow, saplings will develop, but we're talking about processes here of hundreds of years. In some cases, decades, but in many cases, hundreds of years to get the size of the trees back and to get the type of forest that was there before the burn back as well. So if you think about a rainforest, it's not just species, it's structure, it's canopy closure, it's big trees, it's small trees, it's a whole range of life forms and life strategies that interact. It's the most complex terrestrial ecosystem on the planet, and it's known as that for a good reason. It's incredibly complex, and it relies on time and stature and structure and origins to be what it is. So that assault on that 40 million year history is profound. But fortunately, it's not a blanket destruction. It's patchy, and there are many areas that have been fire-free. So we're lucky. Some of our refugia has worked as refugia, and we've managed to hang on to some very, very important areas. But what we need to understand is what was put at risk and what we risk losing. So I guess, what do we need to do? Well, in natural areas, of course, very little. Fortunately, we live in an area where there's a reasonably large area of forest that the natural processes will largely take care of themselves. We may have to intervene for some threatened species in some cases, depending on circumstances. But the reality is that in most cases, in the rainforests and in the eucalypt forests of the nightcap, the natural processes will result in regeneration. But we're going to be looking at a different sort of forest, a smaller stature forest, a more disturbed forest, and a forest that's lost even more of its old growth elements. So that's sad. So when we look at the Huonbrook cliff tops, what we can see there is a matrix of different forest communities. We can see the way from North Rock Road, the fire has swept up the ridges. And those ridges, of course, were transformed by forestry into small wood blackbutt ridges. So if they had been big old growth forests with trees 40 to 50 metres tall, 2 metres in diameter, spaced at 15 metre spacings with a low understory, the impact of fire would be comparatively less. But when you bring the trees in together close, and they're 3 or 4 metres apart, and their crowns are almost touching, and they're only half or less of the height, and you get an intense fire running up from underneath and coming up towards the ridge, it cooks the whole ridge. And so that's what we're seeing. So if you're a koala and you're in a 60 metre tall eucalypt and there's a fire raging underneath you, most likely it's not going to reach you. But if you're in a little patch of regrowth eucalypt, courtesy of forestry, you're going to get cooked.